Welcome to My Life, Tanya Applied, with Rabbi Simon Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A good tavach, a good week. We continue our journey in the life-changing Sefer HaTanya. This program is made possible by Rena Lights LLC, and it's in honor and memory of Rabbi Yosef Halevi Weinberg Olav Shalom, Rabbi Moshe Pinchas HaKohen Katz Olav Shalom, Rabbi Yael HaKohen Khan Olav Shalom. And it's a schus and merit of Rav Zev Yecheskel HaKohen and Risha Katz Le'erich Yamim V'Shanim Tevis for many long years. We'll also dedicate the schus of the remaining hostages. They should all be released unscathed, and the elimination and eradication of the enemies and the worst possible enemies possible, as we've seen. May our Aveda, may our learning, may our mitzvahs help achieve that. And we should have Shalom al Yisrael, the Gula Hamitis V'Ashleim. So we are middle of chapter 24, and in a very methodical way, the Alter Rebbe is laying out a structure as he began discussing in chapter 18 and 19, a new track that every Yid, every Jew, every Neshama has an Ava Mesoteres, Masad Chachmish Benefesh. He has a hidden and innate love connected to the divine, to the truth. And that innate love is what recognizes that the only reality is to be connected to God. And the opposite is something that is completely negated, completely mufrach, impossible for a soul. However, it's concealed, because the neshama comes down below. And as we learned at length, there's a hester upon him, it's tzimtzumim that conceal the divine. But that's the reality. When does it emerge? So in chapters 18, 19, he explains in a time of crisis. When you feel threatened, like it always is, the essence of a person emerges. So when a person is threatened and they see either they're threatened with an ultimatum, either bow down to an Avodah Zarah, serve Avodah Zarah, or you'll be killed. So even a Kal Shebekalim and Pesha Yisrael, as he said, that Ava Mesoteres suddenly emerges. But that only explains in time of crisis. How about in regular routine situation, day-to-day life? When we say Korav Elecha Dover Me'ed, the Ficha B'Vavcha L'Aseh, say all the time. So this is where the Alter Rebbe went into an entire discussion in chapters 20, and now we're up to 24, to explain how fundamentally all mitzvahs and the opposite, all Avedas, all capture the same idea of Anechi Hashem Elokecha, is the positive mitzvahs, is everything is ultimately an expression of the unity of God. And the opposite, Lo Yilecha Elokim Acherim, all Avedas, is a form of disconnection from God. So it's not just Avodah Zarah, not just in the time of crisis, it's always accessible. Korav Elecha Dover Me'ed, it's always within reach. As he explained in these chapters. So in chapters 20 and 21, he explained with the example of Dibur, that all of existence is really the words of God, but it's concealed. So we don't see it, but the truth is that's the reality of all of existence. And then in chapters 22, and he continued that idea, and then in chapter 23, he explained how therefore now we can understand why Torah and mitzvahs, Torah is a raisa v'kudsha bricha kula chad, and mitzvahs is a varin de malka. Ramach mitzvah says the 248 positive mitzvahs are the 248 organs of the king. So through Torah mitzvahs, where there is no hester upon him, there's no concealment, that you connect to God. And then in chapter 24, he says, Zelu Umazah, the chapter we're learning now, same thing Leisa says, the Ada is the antithesis to that every Aveda is a form of disconnect. So when a person is aware of that, then everything is like Avodah Zarah, everything is Elokim Acherim. Anything that defies God's will. And then he further explained, what we learned till now was that when a person doesn't have Eira Chas v'Shalom, it's even worse than the Sitra Achra that conceals. The concealment, you can say, is a divine concealment. And ultimately, like we learned, the Klippas and Sitra Achra don't deny that there's a God. The God of all gods. And they don't defy God's will. Yes, they conceal. And they feel that they're an entity of their own, and that itself is a denial of the all-pervasive divine unity. But when a person does an Aveda, it gives, like he says, it gives it a body. It's not just a spiritual, concealment. It gives it a body. The words that he used was Melubeshes beguf chumri. So by the klipa, it's not melubeshes beguf chumri. It doesn't manifest in a physical body. But in Aveda it does. And that's what makes it worse. Because here he's actually actively, as we discussed at length, actively concealing the divine. So how's that possible? If we said Korav Elecha Dover Me'ed, there's an Ava Mesuteres, it's because there's the concealment. And acting on it gives it body and gives it a reality that causes a person to be much worse than even the klippas themselves. Like he brought from Bilam. Bilam said, I can't defy God's will as much as he wanted to. It's still called Aved Zara, Elikim Acherim, because it does conceal, but at the end of the day, whatever it does is because God wanted it to do that. Whereas a human being, through free will, there it goes even far, it takes it to a whole worse level. Now, he did explain as well how that energy in the Klippas and Sitra Achra works, that it's B'chinas Acharayim, meaning it's not direct divine energy. It's like giving something because God wants the Klippas, he wants it, but in essence, it's not what he wants as an end in itself. So B'chinas Acharayim, so the energy is a very minuscule one, and it's in the form of makif. And even the amount that does enter is in the form of golus, as we discussed. And that's why that's Elikim Achedim. But bottom line is, Adam Ever al Ritzenis Baruch Hu Garua Pochas Harbe Ma'ed Masitra Achra V'Klipa Nikra V'Ed Zara V'Elikim Achedim V'Tachlis HaPirud V'Yichudi V'Achdus Is Baruch Shal Kosh Baruch Yeser Memeno. Okay, Elokefer B'Achdus Is Baruch Yeser Memeno Chas V'Shalom. Because he's giving it body, he's giving it a reality, when it was the whole point was just to overcome the concealment and not allow it to affect us. And then the final piece we learned was from Eitz Chaim that discusses the idea that what this world does, that it's based on the Eitz Chaim that says, Shara shebel mazeh chumri hu shimrei haklipas hagasis v'tachlis habir. It's referring to the ultimate husks and shells the dregs of the coarse klipas at the very end of the refinement process, the basic leftovers. That's what this world is, and that's why that's what allows a person to become even worse than klippas, because the world, this takas, conceals it to the point that it's so concealed in these shells, in these klippas, to the point that all the affairs of the world are tough and evil, are difficult and evil, koshim v'roim, v'arishayim gevrim bay, and the wicked men prevail. V'chulu. This is the Eitz Chaim, and as such, that situation is what causes and allows for a person to come, and if they act the wrong way, they create this situation which is far worse than the concealment itself. Okay. Now, the Alter Rebbe is going to continue and drive home the point that we said at the end of the day, Karav Elecha Dover Me'id. So we still need more explanation. And the fact of the matter is that when a person does do and transgress, the fact of the matter is that still remains, the Ava Musateris remains intact. So he's doing something that goes against his very nature. So Alter Rebbe is now going to elaborate on what that means. Doing something against your very nature. Because you could argue, okay, the concealment create a situation where I don't see godliness, and therefore I do whatever I do, and that's taka worse than the klippas themselves. But there's another element here, like we just emphasized, and that is, it's not just due to a transgression, it's due to an unnatural situation. Because the natural person, the natural neshama would gravitate to connect to its source of life. It's like, would a person ever do something to deprive themselves from oxygen? Or not to feed themselves with healthy sustenance? There has to be some other factor here. So Alter Rebbe is now going to elaborate, how does this Helen V'Hester manifest in a psychological way that doesn't allow us to access our natural selves, and therefore allowing for transgressions. Furthermore, when you say Karav Elecha Dover Me'id B'ficha B'levav Chalasei, so you're saying it's accessible and reachable all the time. In other words, it doesn't require a whole effort. It requires just eliminating this concealment. So where do we see that play itself out? So he's going to bring a Maimer Chazal, a famous Maimer Chazal, and going to analyze it, and we'll see how it applies to this situation. You see here fascinating how Maimer Chazal and Gemara Seita can help us understand the whole personality of what a neshama is, its relationship with God, and why it's possible that even though we're naturally connected to Ava Musateris, and during a time of crisis that will emerge, but even not in a time of crisis, it's also accessible by understanding that it's not our natural state when we do something opposite of what God wants. And that it is indeed a form of Avodah Zarah, Elokim Achedim, and even worse, as we discussed. So he says like this now. Let's continue reading. U'lechein amru Rabbeinu Zal. And that's why Razal say in Seita, right in the beginning, Daf Gimel Amr Aleph. What does it say on the pasuk? The pasuk in Parsha Nosei. So there it talks about the Seita. What is a Seita? So it says, the pasuk says, Kisishta Ishte. That's the way the pasuk describes it. Kisishta Ishe. Kisishta Ishte. Literally it means when a wife will go astray. Sishta from the word sita, like a netiya. This is in Nosei Hey Yud Beis, 5:12. A person, unfortunately, a wife, goes astray and she betrays her husband. Say the Chazal on that, say the Azal on that. Ein odem of Ever Aveda, a man will not commit a sin. Alter Rebbe doesn't bring the end of it, he just brings the beginning. V'chulu, he just says, etc. And the end is, Ein odem Ever Aveda, elim ken nichnus bei ruach shtus. Now, but Pashas is why the Alter Rebbe doesn't bring the whole statement, even though it's so negeya, and he's going to explain it, is because the real focus is Ein Odem Ever Avera. If you think about it, because that's what he wants to bring, that person would not do an Avera. Because you could also, the Lashon Chazal could have been Odem ever aveda kishenichlus bei ruach shtus. Ein odem ever aveda. A person is not capable of doing aveda unless there's some other force that's imposed upon him. And that's the ruach shtus. A type of ruach shtus can be defined a moment of insanity, a delusional spirit, something that deceives him to think that he's not doing something wrong. So ruach shtus. Now, what is the Gemara? What's the diuk of shtus here? Because the Chayre should have said, the pasuk should have said kisita ishte. Why say kisishta? Kisishta, because it also includes the word shtus. The Rebbe Rashab in the Kunter Samayin explains that the two connections, going astray, wandering off, so to speak, betraying, and shtus is all connected. But that's the diuk here, ruach shtus. And as the Mefarshim explained, the Mashal and other Mefarshim explained, that we're talking about Eidon de Aveda. Even though we're learning this dafka from a Seita, a particular Aveda, it's going on all Avedas. So this is a klal now that we have. Now, l'chayra, you could ask a very big question. What do you mean? A person has a yetzer hara. We all know we have temptations and different things that seduce us. So a person doesn't aveda because he's been seduced, he's been tempted. Something distracted him. Why do you have to say it's a delusional spirit? It's a moment of insanity. And we know you can't claim insanity here because the person is responsible for the behavior. Why are we saying that? So this is what the Alter Rebbe is going to explain. Because it's not natural. To bring an example from another place, the Rebbe brings the example about a behemoth sheta. So a behemoth could also be, there's a normal animal, there's an animal that's insane. And what's the example for that? So in the dinim, when you give, let's say, someone to watch over a piece of your a property of yours, including an animal, so you're responsible. Even a Shem Rachinim has certain responsibilities to make sure the animal doesn't hurt anyone, that the animal itself doesn't get hurt. So the question is, what happens if you're given an animal to watch and you accepted the responsibility, and the animal jumped into a fire? What's the din? Are you responsible? Now, if the animal did something like trample on somebody's property or hurt someone, you're responsible. That's what you were hired to even if you weren't paid, but that's what you accepted to watch. But the animal jumped into a fire. And the answer is no, you're not responsible. Because a normal behemoth, a normal behemoth would never jump into a fire. Because a behemoth knows fire is dangerous. You were not told it was a crazy behemoth, an insane animal that jumps into fire. So you assumed it's an animal that is a normal animal that would never jump into fire, so you're not responsible for something that's not normal. A behemoth shaitik jumps into fire. It's the same idea. Would any normal person put their hand in fire? Of course not. If you see someone put their hand in fire, God forbid, it's either because they don't know it's fire, or they don't know that fire burns. That's the ruach shtus. So it's an abnormal situation. It's an aberration. An anomaly. An aberration would be the better word. That's a ruach shtus. Because a neshama would never do something that goes against God's will. Because the neshama is connected to Ava Misoteres. So how is it possible? Because there's a concealment. That concealment manifests in the ruach shtus. And the same thing, the opposite. Every neshama, like the Alter Rebbe, like the Rambam, Paskins, the end of chapter 2 in Hilchos Gerushin, that every neshama wants to do mitzvahs, every yid wants to do mitzvahs, and doesn't want to do avedas. So if you see something, it's yitzrei husha anseh. The yetzer, the ruach shtus, is that force that concealed, that created a moment of blindness, as he's going to explain now. And Alter Rebbe says, "Dafilu isha mina efesh shadaita kala." So here now you understand also why he brings this, the Gemara. Dafka by Seiti. You could say that every Aveda is like this. He says, even a Isha, I feel a Isha min of Ephes. Someone that's on such a low level, a weak-minded individual, an adulteress, that's what min of Ephes means. So you would think a person like that, is weak, tempted, however you explain it. So that, no. If we're talking about someone who's a very high level person, you see they do an Aveda, you could say something came in the way, some blindness. But you're talking about a person who's weak-minded and gave in to temptations. Nevertheless, she could have controlled her lustful urges. That's what the Gemara is saying. Were it not for the delusional spirit, were it not for this moment of blindness and insanity within her, she would have been able to control it. Even a person on that level. Why? Because she has ultimately an Ava Misoteres. So were it not for the Ruach Shtushaba, Hamachaso Master Ramailim, that covers, hides, and conceals, as a Ava Misoteres, Shebanafsha Alekis, the dormant love in her divine soul, were it not for this moment of insanity or blindness, she would have controlled herself. So there we go, we start seeing now that every person, it's only due to another force that's at work here. That concealment, and this that manifests in the Ruach Shtus. Even a person of this caliber, even a Kal Shebekalim in Pesha Yisrael, doesn't use that expression here, but Al Derech Zeh. And what is that? Dormant love, Ava Misoteres, compel a person, the divine soul, to do L'dofka ba'amunas Hashem v'yichudei v'achdusei, to connect and cleave with the faith in God and God's unity and oneness. That's what the neshama does on its own. It's ad Ava Misoteres. V'lo liporet chas v'shalom achdusei. And not to separate in any way and become detached from his oneness, God forbid. So we learned earlier in chapters 18, 19, especially in chapter 18, that when a person is threatened, there's a crisis that emerges. But the fact is, it's always there. And that's why, for there to be a sin, even in this low caliber situation, has to be some other force that came into play. Take away the Ruach Shtus, Luli the Ruach Shtus, you wouldn't have this problem. Like we learned there, Afila Neitli Mesnafsha, Mimeno Lava Daved Zara Chaz V'Shalom. Like we learned that when a person even if it was taking away her life, she would never do a commit Veda Zara, God forbid. And that's mamish the thread of life, which everybody wants to live. Because that's how powerful the Ava Misoteres is. And it refers also to Isha Min Efes. If you pose the situation of a Veda Zara in front of her, and she was threatened in that way, that type of crisis, no. She would not be even Aveda Zara. Va'afilu b'shtachavo levado bli shum amuna b'lev klal. That even at the cost of her life, and even it's only a bow that can be superficial, meaningless, empty. Like he said, "B'liya b'li shum amunah b'lev klal." She doesn't believe at all, but even the mere fact that it appears that you're bowing down, this woman would not give in to that. And Kolshkein, says the Alter Rebbe, if that's the case with Avodah Zarah and death, for Kolshkein lich b'shayetzer v'tayvus haniyuf. Certainly then, she could overcome on her own, were it not for the moment of insanity and blindness, the temptation and desire for niyuf, for betraying her husband, for adultery. Shehem Yisurim Kalim Mimisa, a sacrifice which is easier than suffering death. Hashem Yishmerenu. May God spare us, protect us. So the fact that she's capable of doing that tells you, and that she would sacrifice even more, her very life, let alone for this desire. That tells you there must be another force at work. That's what he says here. So now we have a manifest definition of how the Hester Ponim, the Helen Behester, the concealments, affect the person in a form of a Ruach Shtus. And that's what happens when a person that is capable of doing something which goes against the very essence of who they are, which is being one with godliness. So if you think about it, it's powerful, extremely powerful. It's a whole new take on human beings. Because generally you think, okay, you have a Yetzer Tov, wants to connect to God. You have a Yetzer Hara that wants to do its own thing. But here we're telling us the Yetzer Hara is an aberration. It's completely unnatural. And the Nefesh Elokis is natural. Now, it still doesn't mean that we don't have a battle. That's the whole point. But it takes on a whole different shape because now you understand that your neshama really wants to connect, but you have blindness. So the Kodev Elecha Dover Meid, as we'll learn later, becomes something really accessible, unreachable, because that's who you naturally are, even after you have a Yetzer Hara, because the Yetzer Hara is coming, this Ruach Shtus. It's the moment of blindness and the moment of insanity. So ultimately, taking a Maimar Chazal like this, we're coming to learn the unbelievable quality of a neshama. That's only because of the Ruach Shtus. Without Lule Ruach Shtus, without that moment of insanity and blindness, a person would be completely connected. So we'll stop here. Everyone have a good tavach. This has been TanyaApplied.com, where you can go to find all the previous programs. Should be a good gebenched week, and month, and year. Again, only good news for Eden everywhere. And finally, an end to this dark Golus, and the Geula Hamitis Vashleim.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied, with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit ChasidusApplied.com for archived classes and more resources.